Well, dear friends, Professor Nayan Chanda in the chair, colleagues, friends, my seniors in the profession. I can see privileged enough to have Sanjay Saab here, Darren Billy, the others who are equally, their scholarship is very important. First of all, let me thank the organizers of the conference, especially K.N. Srivastav Saab, the director IIC, and Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, Executive Director IIC, for approaching me for making this presentation. Let me confess that when I was approached and asked to present a paper on Alberuni in this panel entitled Stories of Travel and Encounter, I expressed my reservations to speak on this particular theme. As much has already been written on it. In fact, Sakau's own introduction is quite comprehensive. And then we have Ainsley Embry's paper, An Outsider's View, Alberuni, published in Imaging India, edited by Mark Juergensmeer by Oxford University Press in 1989. Plus, that I myself had already contributed on it in 2020 in an edited volume, Alternative Arguments, Essays in Honor of Surendra Gopal, which was an edited volume published by Primus. Instead, I suggested that I be allowed to talk about another such encounter right then, which would be more relevant today, the memoirs of the recently much maligned and misrepresented Zahiruddin Muhammad Babar, who, like Alberuni, was a scholar par excellence, but unlike him, a conqueror too. Anyhow, I was asked to deduce Alberuni's perceptions about India and its people and postpone the other topic for some future occasion. Let us at the outset point out that Alberuni regarded Hindus, that is within inverted commas, as excellent philosophers, and he felt strong inclination towards Hindu philosophy, but on the other hand, he was a Muslim and at times does not fail to point out the superiority of Islam over Brahmanic India. He attacks Arabs, but not Islam. Abu Rehan Alberuni came into contact with India, then popular as Hind, at the ripe age of 44 years, when he was forced to come here as a glorified prisoner in the company of Sultan Mahmud ibn Subuktagin, when the latter invaded the subcontinent in 1017 AD. He himself was a proud Khwarezmian, a territory now identified as Khiva. Khwarezm had itself been devastated by Mahmud, who before returning back to Ghazni had taken many prisoners of war with him. But it appears that in spite of being a prisoner, Alberuni had been given certain freedoms when he was made to march with the invading army of the man who had not so long ago first conquered Alberuni's own homeland. Thus, he does not particularly appear enamored by the great Sultan Mahmud, for whom he uses barest of words of praise. In the words of Sakau, he was, and I quote him, a political prisoner kept on honorable terms, unquote, and who was allowed to live in India between 1017 to 1030, that is when Mahmud died, and spent his time with, and I quote again, with no official inducement or encouragement or hope of reward to carry on his study of the new civilization which the Ghaznavites had encountered. Although Tahqiq Ma'al Hind, popular as Kitabul Hind, was the first known scholarly study of the subcontinent, yet the Ghaznavite conquest was not the first encounter between political Islam and India. Sindh and parts of Punjab were already under the Fatimid rule, which was destabilized and broken by Mahmud's invasions. Thus, one has to remember that Alberuni's account of India and its people, that is Tahqiq Ma'al Hind, is not that of a conqueror, nor of the first Muslim contact with India, for an excellent account in the sense of but it is an account in the sense of an account of or in the sense of an account of a conqueror. For example, the Babarnama, also known as Tuzuk-e-Babari, which I think would be a better choice to understand what the understanding of India, one civilization, by a conqueror would have been. Kitabul Hind, Alberuni's India, however, is the first dispassionate description of India by a foreigner. Greek accounts, perhaps, were the first accounts of people of a different civilization writing about India. Herodotus, Megasthenes, Xenophon, Arrian, Strabo, etc. were some of those who wrote about India, its people, its geography, and its mythologies. But all emphasize the exotic and the negative. For example, Herodotus in Book 3rd of his histories mentions that most Indian tribes lived together like brute beasts, and that in Indian deserts there are, and I quote him, great ants in size somewhat less than dogs but bigger than foxes. These examples can be multiplied. In contrast, Alberuni wastes no time on the bizarre and fantastic, which had been the hallmark of the foreign perceptions so far. Ainsley Embry thus says that, and I quote him, no one has produced a book at once so objective, so learned, and so compassionate, and that no other work from the period remotely touches it in accuracy of observation and breadth of coverage. According to Embry, the concern with the strange and fantastic in another civilization is actually a device to avoid coming in terms with it. Alberuni had come to terms with it and had dug deep into what India was and who its people were, without much religious prejudice or the conqueror's perspective. K.M. Panikkar described his work as a moment in world history. A proper understanding of Alberuni's study of Indian civilization can only be had if one keeps in mind the motive and purpose for which he wrote. As I had already mentioned, he was not approaching India from the position or pedestal of a conqueror. His homeland too had been very recently vanquished by the same armies which now he was accompanying. He was no mujahid or holy warrior. Perhaps as a fellow sufferer at the hands of Sultan Mahmud, having lost both his personal independence and of his homeland, he empathized with India and its people. Both had been ill-treated and by the same conqueror. He was a scientist, a munajjim, an astrologer, astronomer. And it is as such that he had gained his place in the Ghaznavid court. During the reign of Sultan Mahmud, when he gained his rightful independence, he wrote his book on the field to which he had dedicated his life, that is astronomy, a book called Al-Qanud al-Masudi. He specifically underlines his purpose both in the preface to his book as well as in the conclusion. He says that every knowledge which existed about India was, and I quote him, second hand, which one had copied from the other. And I once again quote him, never sifted by the sieve of critical examination. He further cites a master scholar of his time, Abu Sahel, who incited him to write down what he knew about Indians. Within inverted commas, I again quote Alberuni, as a help to those who want to discuss religious questions with them, that is, the Indians, and as a repertory of information to those who want to associate with them, unquote. In the very first para of the preface, he tells us that there are a number of types of reporters, akhbar, some who tell lies to promote their own interests, others who lie on the basis of personal likes and dislikes, still others who lie as they, by their very nature, can never speak truth. Then there are some who resort to lies as they blindly follow others, who tell them to lie. He then quotes the holy book, the Quran. Speak truth, even if it were against yourselves. My book, Kitabul Hind, he says, is nothing but a simple historic record of facts. He also stresses that his book is not a polemical one. In the concluding remarks to his book, he further writes, and I quote, "We think now that what we have related in this book will be sufficient for anyone who wants to converse with Hindus and to discuss with them questions of religion, science, or literature, and I emphasize, on the very basis of their civilization." If one reads his Kitabul Hind, he finds the Indians, he calls them Hindus because they are the inhabitants of Al-Hind, as excellent philosophers, good mathematicians, and astronomers. Being one himself, he, however, takes pride in his own knowledge, yet does see that they knew their subject. He appreciates the mental achievements of the Indian scientists and goes at length to read and understand their work. His book is full of words of appreciation for those things which he found good, but does not fail to record things which he did not appreciate. Like Darashikoh, many centuries later, he believed in the Indian philosophy being monotheistic in nature, but which later on got contaminated. He writes, after interacting with his Brahmin interlocutors, that they too worship, he says, one sole Almighty God in the initial stages. And I quote him, "The first cause of idolatry was This is what he says: the desire of commemorating the dead and consoling the living. But on this basis, it has developed and has finally become a foul and pernicious abuse. At one place, that is in volume 2 of his work, he talks of Indian scholars as enjoying the help of God. At another place, while discussing Brihat Samhita of Varaha Mihira, he talks of the author being guided by divine inspiration. He is not looking down the religion of the people about which he is writing. One more thing which one notes is that at places where he is critical of some Hindu practice, he justifies it by comparing it with pre-Islamic Arabs. He declares that the Arabs had also been as bad, if not worse. He simply does not outrightly condemn the Indians for those practices or thought which he found repugnant. At places where he finds things beyond justification, on such occasions he just writes, and I quote, "To such things, silence is the only proper answer." Now, in this paper, which is quite long, I go on to discuss Alberuni's various views about the culture and society of the country. He talks about the caste system. He talks about the rigidity of the caste system. He tells us about the number of varnas which he encountered, but instead of narrating them verbatim here, because already all of us sitting here know about what Alberuni had to comment about the Indian society, I would only stress on the fact that Alberuni was in fact only reporting what was being reported to him by his Brahmins with whom he was talking. It was not the practical side of the story which he was narrating. Most of it was an idealized version which was being put before him by the Brahmins themselves. His own views, which are of more interest and directly of his own, are those which Alberuni makes about science and other matters about which he himself knew. Before I actually close, without going into all the details, I would also like to mention that perhaps Kitab-ul-Hind is also one of the first of the books written about India, about Hindustan, where the concept of a subcontinent is described. He situates Hind between the high mountain ranges on one side and the sea on the other. He says India is a land limited by the Indian Ocean in the south, with mountains and ranges on all the other three sides. Commenting on the nature of the soil, he mentions that it consists of rounded stones which are huge near the mountains, where the rivers have a violent current, but then there are stones of smaller size at greater distances from the mountains, where streams flow more slowly, and the stones appear pulverized in the shape of sand, which all led him to conclude that, once again within quotations, India has had once been a sea, which by degrees has been filled up by the alluvium of these streams. At one point of time, talking about the Indian scientific knowledge, he says that the Indian knowledge of science is just like a bucket full of, sometimes dung with pearls embedded within it. So I'm not saying that he doesn't have that superior feeling of a Muslim. He does. But then he is actually, nice enough that he also says that there are pearls within the Indian thought and sciences. Thank you very much.